Sam Clemens was a Southerner, a printer's apprentice turned newspaperman. He became famous as Mark Twain, the voice of Western mining camps and Mississippi riverboats. He traveled the world, but he built his home at Nook Farm in Hartford, Connecticut. There, he settled among the most powerful voices of New England activism. At Nook Farm, he raised his family, witnessed the religious scandal of the decade, amused a tumultuous nation with his wit, saved a president's family from destruction, and lost a fortune on an invention. At Nook Farm, Mark Twain wrote the story that would define for the world what it was to be a Connecticut Yankee. The Civil War created an economic boom for Hartford. Yankee tradesmen who built rifles, revolvers, and Gatling guns at the Colt Firearms Company turned their ingenuity to the manufacture of typewriters and telephones. As Ulysses S. Grant leads the final battles of the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the most famous author of the time, uses the profits from her anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin to build Oakholm, her idealized mansion at Nook Farm. Isabella Beecher Hooker, Harriet's sister, begins her crusade for women's rights. Her older sister, Catherine Beecher, will bitterly oppose Isabella on the issue of women's suffrage. The Beechers are a primary spiritual and moral force in the United States.
Well, the Beechers in general had their hand in just about every reform that went on in the 19th century. They all had schemes and plans in their back pockets, and they were determined to have a powerful influence on shaping the character of the new nation.
From his pulpit at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, Henry Ward Beecher, a fiery abolitionist preacher who had advocated sending rifles to John Brown in boxes marked Bibles, now advocates a new gospel of love. He urges listeners to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land.
Henry Ward Beecher was a phenomenal wordsmith, so much so that great writers like Twain, Walt Whitman, flocked to hear him speak.
Mr. Beecher's sermons breathe the truest and purest spirit of religion. They are models of pulpit oratory. They are proofs that the subject which is the nearest to the interest of mankind can be put to nobler uses than the chloroforming of congregations.
Mark Twain, a professed agnostic, boards the ship Quaker City on the pilgrimage to the Holy Land that Henry Ward Beecher inspired. The newspaper Alta California syndicates his humorous travel letters, and his popularity spreads throughout the country. When he leaves New York, he has no idea that his adventure will link his life with the Beechers and lead him to Nook Farm.
Circumstance and temperament determine men's lives, and from one circumstance another develops, as links in a chain. When I returned to America, circumstance was waiting on the pier with the last link. The conspicuous, the consummating, the victorious link. I was asked to write a book, and I did it and called it The Innocents Abroad. Then I became at last a member of the Literary Guild.
Elisha Bliss of Hartford's American Publishing Company offers to turn Twain's articles into a subscription book. In New York, Twain shares his good news about the book with his Quaker City companion, Charlie Langdon. Twain meets and falls in love with Langdon's sister, Olivia.
I started to make calls New Year's Day, but anchored for the day at the first house I came to. Charlie Langdon's sister was there, a beautiful girl, and Miss Alice Hooker, another beautiful girl, a niece of Henry Ward Beecher's. We sent the old folks home early, with instructions not to send the carriage till midnight, and then I just stayed there and worried the life out of those girls.
In January of 1868, Sam Clemens makes his first visit to Hartford.
I think this is the best built and handsomest town I have ever seen. They call New England the land of steady habits, and I can see the evidence about me that it was not named amiss. As I came along the principal streets today, smoking, of course, I noticed of the 200 men in sight at one time, only 2 were smoking besides myself. I had to walk 3 blocks to find a cigar store. I saw no drinking saloons at all in the street. but I was not looking for any. I hear no swearing here. I see no one chewing tobacco. I found nobody drunk. What a singular country it is.
In 1853, John Hooker and his brother-in-law Francis Gillette buy Nook Farm on the outskirts of Hartford and subdivide it. An ardent abolitionist and social reformer, Hooker invites like-minded friends and family to buy lots and build houses on the farm. Hooker is married to Isabella Beecher. Her sisters Harriet and Mary both build houses in the neighborhood. Outstanding architects design houses for the socially minded and wealthy elite who are drawn to the community. The Civil War hero General Fighting Joe Hawley, newly elected governor of Connecticut, builds a house on the farm. With writer and neighbor Charles Dudley Warner, he buys the newspaper The Hartford Courant. The Hookers' house is a gathering spot for relatives, friends, neighbors, and political and literary visitors.
I've had a tip-top time here for a few days as a guest of Mr. John Hooker's family. Beecher relatives. Puritans are mighty straight-laced, and they won't let me smoke in the parlor. But the Almighty don't make any better people.
The Asylum Hill Congregational Church serves the wealthy and prestigious Nook Farm community. Twain nicknames it the Church of the Holy Speculators. The Reverend Joseph Twitchell, the pastor of the church, overhears the remark and laughs. The two men embark on a lifelong friendship, and Twitchell becomes Twain's trusted confidant and adviser. Twain tells Twitchell of his desire to buy into the Hartford Courant and settle at Nook Farm.
When Twain was setting his sights on Hartford, he was interested in buying into the Hartford Courant. He had approached the two publishers, Hawley and Warner, and inquired about this possibility. And at this time, the owners were not interested in having another partner. And anyway, who was this Twain fellow? Twain really hadn't accomplished that much yet as a writer of fiction, was not yet the kind of great celebrity he would be by the mid-70s when he is situated in Hartford. So in the end, they didn't give him the opportunity to buy in.
In the spring, the Hooker's daughter Alice marries John Calvin Day. Olivia Langdon is a bridesmaid, and Clemens accompanies Livy to the society wedding at Nook Farm. He asks Joseph Twitchell to preside at his own wedding to Livy later that year in Elmira, New York. The idyllic landscape of Nook Farm is the playing field for a brewing controversy surrounding women's rights. The Beecher sisters differ in their views of the Victorian ideal of womanhood. Catherine Beecher, who had opened one of the first schools for women in Hartford, believes that women are the chief guardians of a high moral code for society, and their duty is to instill those values into their families at home. Isabella Beecher Hooker supports Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's crusade to gain the vote for women. The sufferings of women stir Harriet, particularly those of her friend Lady Anna Byron, who had confided to her the horrors of her marriage to the romantic poet Lord Byron. In 1869, Harriet Beecher Stowe charges in the Atlantic Monthly that Lord Byron had an incestuous affair with his half-sister, Augusta Lee. The story creates a storm that rivals the one Uncle Tom's Cabin set off. The press heaps attacks on Stowe, and Mark Twain defends her in an editorial in the Buffalo Express. Public sentiment turns against her in both Great Britain and the United States.
I really think she viewed her story on Lady Byron as the Uncle Tom's Cabin of women's situation, but it completely backfired. Talking about incest, she was really breaking a taboo that was very powerful, and people just weren't ready to hear about that, and she got condemned for talking about it publicly. Her career recovered, but she never again attempted to talk on sexual issues or women's issues.
Harriet's book sales drop. Financial pressures lead the Stowe family to abandon Oakholm and move to a simpler house in the neighborhood. As Harriet's fortunes decline, Twain's literary reputation grows. Innocents Abroad is a success, and Twain finishes Roughing It. He then begins to look for a residence in Hartford. The Hookers offer to rent their home to him for an indefinite period. In October of 1871, Sam, Livy, and their baby son Langdon move into the Hooker house, where Clemens stayed on his first trip to Hartford. Life at Nook Farm brings the young family joy and sadness. Their second child, Olivia Susan, is born in Elmira on March 19, 1872. In June, Langdon dies at the Hooker house in Hartford.
Just a song at twilight, when the lights are low, and the flickering shadows softly come and go. Though the heart be weary, sad the day and long, still to us at twilight comes love's old song, comes love's old sweet song.
Twain moved to Hartford in 1871 and was attracted to the Nook Farm neighborhood. One of the reasons he was attracted was because of its celebrity, its notoriety, which very much was triggered by the fact that Harry Beecher Stowe had lived here since 1860. Stowe, we have to remember at this time, was really a titan in American letters, one of the most powerful and influential of writers in American culture at mid-century, and still so widely regarded and known around the world by the 1860s and early 70s. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Twain and Stowe are fully a generation apart. Day, visiting Mrs. Stowe, and Twain, in his obvious casualness, didn't wear a tie. Mrs. Stowe said nothing, of course, being so genteel and a wonderful woman. When Twain came back, though, and reported to Livy that he had gone over to Mrs. Stowe, and when Livy saw that Twain didn't have a tie on, she was shocked, and she said, well, you really have to make up for this somehow. So Twain arranged to have his tie put in a little box, and it was taken over to Mrs. Stowe by Twain's butler with a note that said, thank you again for the visit, and oh, by the way, here is the rest of me for you to enjoy.
Dear Mr. Clemens, you have discovered the principle. You probably don't know it, as didn't Isaac Newton when the apple fell, but you have. You have discovered that a man can call by installments. It is a discovery. Allow me to thank you for the prolonged pleasure. May not a man in extremes send his hat and boots to call? I suggest the question. Yours truly, H.B. Stowe.
Isabella Beecher Hooker organizes a national women's suffrage convention in Washington. She is determined to address Congress and demand a 16th Amendment to the Constitution allowing women to vote.
Sister Hattie says when she had finished Uncle Tom, she was at rest, but she nearly died with the pent-up feeling before that. So I, on this woman question, see and feel so clearly the truth I can hardly breathe till I have borne my testimony.
Between 1868 and 1871, there was a lot of public discourse around issues of marriage, sexuality, divorce. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were bringing those issues to the fore in great public meetings. They were using whatever scandal might have erupted at the time to really talk about, well, what does it mean to be a wife, not to really have any recourse if you're married to a drunkard, if you're married to somebody who beats you, you have to stay with this person. So all of these issues of women's rights within the domestic sphere were suddenly being talked about.
For a group of middle-class New England women, such ideas are scandalous. The women form the American Women's Suffrage Association and elect Henry Ward Beecher president. The National Women's Suffrage Association elects Beecher's younger and more liberal colleague, Theodore Tilton, as its president. As Isabella works on her speech for Congress, Victoria Woodhull, the first woman stockbroker on Wall Street, uses her connections to become the first woman to address a congressional committee on behalf of women's suffrage. Woodhull states that there is no need for a constitutional amendment because, according to the 14th Amendment, she and all women already have the right to vote. Isabella, although surprised and upstaged, supports Victoria's position. While the Congressional Committee deliberates, Catherine Beecher leads a group of women who sign a petition against female suffrage. They claim to represent the majority of women in the country in the belief that Holy Scripture inculcates for women a sphere higher and apart from that of public life.
Catherine and Isabella are 20 years apart in age, an entire generation, and they have perspectives that reflect that difference. Catherine Beecher was the most conservative of the girls, the Beecher girls, and Isabella was the most radical. She was allied as a friend and supporter, Isabella was, with Victoria Woodhull, who was an advocate of free love, who was promoting this as an issue, and who Victoria Woodhull was very good at promoting herself.
If Congress refused to listen to and grant what women ask, there is but one course left then to pursue. Women have no government. Men have organized a government, and they maintain it to the utter exclusion of women. Under such glaring inconsistencies, such unwarrantable tyranny, such unscrupulous despotism, what is there left for women to do but to become the mothers of the future government?
The Judiciary Committee dismisses her petition, and Woodhull announces that she will run for the presidency. Woodhull's views on women's suffrage and free love polarize the nation and the Beecher sisters. Her admirers hail her as Queen Victoria. Her critics denounce her as Mrs. Satan.
People after the American Revolution, of course, are centered on the question of freedom. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a free people? And if one looks at the rhetoric of the early 19th century, one finds free everything. Free markets, free labor, free grace on Methodist preaching. One finds free love.
Free lovers argued that their approach was really more moral than expecting somebody to be in a conjugal sexual relationship with someone with whom they had no longer anything in common, with somebody who was abusing them. That for them to freely enter into a sexual union was much more moral, much purer, much more in line with God's law than it was to artificially stay in a man-made institution that people believed somehow that they couldn't change.
Henry Ward Beecher, at the time of the Civil War and right after the Civil War, is seriously thinking, as are many other people, about how to loosen up the strict marital bond so that it can accommodate strong and even passionate friendships with other adults of the opposite sex. And of course, to my mind, unanswerable question is whether he took this doctrine of new openness completely towards adultery with Elizabeth Tilton.
Over a chess game, Theodore Tilton tells Elizabeth Cady Stanton that his wife, Elizabeth, confessed to a free love relationship with Henry Ward Beecher. Both Tiltons were parishioners at Beecher's Plymouth Church. Stanton repeats the story to Victoria Woodhull and Isabella Beecher Hooker. In her newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, Woodhull reports that the country's most renowned clergyman secretly practices the free love doctrines he denounces from the pulpit. Within days, Victoria is arrested and imprisoned for sending obscene material through the mail. Harriet Beecher Stowe accuses Victoria of libel.
The fireworks between the Beecher sisters and Victoria, between Catherine and Harriet and Victoria, are just skyrocketing throughout the 1870s. And I think Harriet goes to her brother's avid defense partly because she's so eager to get at Victoria Woodhull and destroy her credibility and her influence.
Harriet herself was allied with Henry, her beloved next youngest sibling, the one whom she had loved most all of her life in her family. And Isabella didn't understand how Harriet could do that, how Harriet could be allied with Henry when it was clear to Isabella that Henry had had this affair. And of course, we don't know what actually happened, if Henry did or Henry didn't.
The scandal grows in the newspapers. Theodore Tilton, aware that his reputation is suffering, sues Beecher for alienation of affections. The trial of the decade begins. Isabella encourages her brother to confess his sin. Henry calls Isabella insane. At Nook Farm, Harriet and Catherine turn family and neighbors against Isabella. Sam Clemens returns to Nook Farm from a lecture tour and forbids Livy to visit Isabella. He and Twitchell travel to New York to attend the court proceedings. The trial ends in July. After 6 days, the jurors are unable to reach a verdict. Twain loses respect for Beecher.
The major importance of the scandal and of the trial, which was the main part of the scandal, is that it gave people at that time a place to hang all of their most basic doubts and preoccupations and fears about the future of their culture. And the major fear at the time was what's happening to American religion, to the foundations of American morality, therefore. I think the trial had a serious effect on the women's rights movement also. I think it was a setback for a broad conception of women's rights.
Spiritualism and women's rights were closely allied at this time because, interestingly, when the spirits spoke, they often spoke very powerfully to women about emancipating them from their roles. So there were reasons to listen to those spirits if you were a woman who wanted to have a wider sphere.
Late one evening, Isabella falls into a spiritualist trance. Her vision reveals that at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, she will assume the presidency of a matriarchal government. It will spread from the United States across the whole of the world, and under her leadership, merge with the kingdom of Christ in a great millennial period.
I am almost indifferent to everything but the great spiritual outlook, and ready to sacrifice everything to the advancement of Christ's kingdom, life on earth.
Isabella Beecher Hooker was not insane, as her siblings sometimes suggested. She was sincerely convinced that she could communicate through mediums to the departed, and she was not alone. There were many, many people who believed this. Victoria Woodhull, probably Harriet Beecher Stowe's husband. There were many people around Nook Farm who took this extremely seriously.
On New Year's Eve, Isabella welcomes the Clemenses, the Warner family, the Gillettes, and her daughters Mary and Alice and their families to a party where the announcement of her new matriarchal government will be made. Governor and Mrs. Hawley bring a magnificent casket made of raisins, representing the death of the old year. Isabella has hidden a group of mediums who are conducting a séance in her bedroom. She anxiously awaits the stroke of midnight, when the mediums will emerge with the revelation of her new role. The parlor is full of guests singing carols, but at the stroke of midnight, nothing happens.
But I think about those women who spent all those years in passionate commitment to votes for women and never succeeded in their lifetimes. It wasn't until their daughters or their granddaughters' lifetimes that they were successful in just getting the vote.
Isabella Beecher Hooker organized women until her death in 1910, but was never allowed to cast her vote. Great financial upheavals characterized the end of the 1800s. Speculation and corruption caused the collapse of businesses. Industrialists, corporations, utilities, bankers, and brokers are increasingly viewed as the enemy by the working class, whose wages have stagnated while men who are already millionaires get richer. Strikes turn violent as workers demand more money. Labor unions spring up to represent these angry and beleaguered workers. President Ulysses S. Grant, ineffective in dealing with widespread political corruption during his first term in office, stops at Nook Farm, where Charles Dudley Warner digs in his kitchen garden. Warner writes about Grant's visit in My Summer in the Garden, a book that wins him national acclaim.
President Grant was here just before the 4th, getting his mind quiet for that event by a few days of retirement, staying with a friend at the head of our street. And I asked him if he wouldn't like to come down our way Sunday afternoon and take a plain, simple look at my garden, eat a little lemon ice cream and jelly cake, and drink a glass of native lager beer. The president is a great talker, contrary to general impression, but I think he appreciated his quiet hour in my garden.
Some of the relationships that Twain had with Nook Farm residents were very important for his creative work. In particular, we should think of the Gilded Age. Twain and Charles Warner were complaining about, the state of American letters, and there hasn't been a good novel written in years, and things are just terrible. And so finally, the wives, tired of hearing this, said, well, why don't you solve the problem and write a great novel yourselves? And so, of course, they rose to the challenge, and they spent the next few months writing, separately from one another, the work that would become known as the Gilded Age. It's a tale of political corruption and failed land deals and the loss of innocence and a remarkable battery of characters, many, many characters in this work. But they produced this work that was wonderful and, in the end, very important in defining Twain's role as a social critic in those early years. And it's perfect when you think about it that he would do this with Warner, who was a writer of some success in his own right, but also in a day-to-day fashion the publisher of the Hartford Courant. So they really had this sense of what was happening now in American life, in politics and finance, and all of that gets absorbed directly into the Gilded Age. But this is an example of a work that emerged quite specifically out of one evening's dinner here in Nook Farm.
The Clemenses live in the Hooker House for 3 years. Finally, their home at Nook Farm is completed. Designed by the New York architect Edward Tuckerman Potter, the modified Gothic structure is unconventional and the talk of the town. To some people, it looks like a Mississippi riverboat. As the construction progresses, Livy and Sam visit the house every day. According to the builder, Mrs. Clemens objected to climbing so many stairs, and Mr. Clemens picked her up and gaily mounted the stairs, the couple laughing and chiding one another in sheer delight at the completed mansion. In his new home, Twain begins to write Tom Sawyer.
One of the challenges, of course, for all of us is to look at the house today and think of it as this wonderful home that, Aunt Minnie would have had, and not recognize that, in fact, it was an aggressively avant-garde, cosmopolitan, cutting-edge work of modernism. This was an aggressively, almost breathtakingly modern house by this young couple. A modern house with wonderfully modern and aggressive interiors by Louis Comfort Tiffany. It's a house filled with modern ideas, of progressive social ideas. And then finally, of course, it's the birthplace of the modern American literary voice with Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and other great works that are hatched here in Hartford.
There was something romantic, even dramatic, about the atmosphere of this home of ours in Hartford, Connecticut. It was a brick building with many little turrets, porches, and towers. 3 floors of various shaped rooms provided suitable scenes for almost any novel or drama one might be reading. There was a beautiful conservatory off the library, and the scent from the plants brought reality to some of the tropical scenes described by Father. In my parents' bedroom was a large Venetian bed that had an angel on each of the 4 posts. The angels could be removed, and we frequently took them down and washed them in a small bathtub.
When Susie was 13 and was a slender little maid with tails of copper-tinged brown hair down her back, and was perhaps the busiest bee in the household hive, she secretly and of her own motion and out of love added another task to her labors, the writing of a biography of me. She did this work in her bedroom at night and kept her record hidden. After a little, the mother discovered it and filched it and let me see it, then told Susie what she had done and how pleased I was and how proud. I remember that time with deep pleasure.
We are a very happy family. We consist of Papa, Mama, Jean, Clara, and me. It is Papa I am writing about, and I shall have no trouble in not knowing what to say about him, as he is a very striking character. Few people know Papa. Really know him. They think of Mark Twain as a humorist joking at everything. I have wanted Papa to write a book that would reveal something of his kind, sympathetic nature, and The Prince and the Pauper partly does it. The book is full of lovely, charming ideas and language. It is perfect.
My boy, you ought to have been here tonight to see Susie and Clara and a dozen of the neighbors' children play a half a dozen stirring scenes from The Prince and the Pauper. One of the prettiest private theatrical performances I have ever seen. Audience of 25 neighbors. Mrs. Clemens has been drilling these kids 3 or 4 weeks in their parts, and tonight the thing was sprung on me as a surprise. When it is repeated, you must run up and see it.
In the next family production, Clemens plays the role of Miles Hendon.
He acted his part beautifully, and he added to the scene, making it a good deal longer. He was inexpressibly funny, with his great slouch hat and gait. Oh, such a gait. He certainly could have been an actor as well as an author.
William Hooker Gillette, an aspiring actor in the neighborhood, is given his first role in a professional production of The Prince and the Pauper, despite the protests of his father, Senator Francis Gillette. Twain also lends the young actor $3,000 to help with his career. Gillette's portrayal of Sherlock Holmes will make him one of the most popular actors on the American stage. The summer days are gentle. Alice Hooker Day often visits Livy and brings her little girls, Catherine and Alice, to play with the Clemens children.
We did love Nook Farm and played with those highly cultivated and traveled children. My memory gives glimpses of those households, their neighborliness, the lovely forest trees and wildflowers. Clara was slight, dark, and as pretty as she could be, and Jean was a charming, serious girl. Susie was a beautiful, slender girl with dark eyes, full of intelligence. Catherine Day.
The other evening, Clara and I brought down our new soap bubble water, and we all blew soap bubbles. Papa blew his soap bubbles and filled them with tobacco smoke, and as the light shone on them, they took very beautiful opaline colors. Papa would hold them and then let us catch them in our hand, and they felt delightful to the touch. The mixture of the smoke and water had a singularly pleasant effect.
The Clemens family is central to life at Nook Farm. People gather on summer evenings to watch the children play. The neighborhood women meet regularly on Saturday mornings to discuss current events, culture, and history. The Saturday morning club often convenes on the Clemens veranda. In the spring and fall, Sam invites his close friend, Reverend Joseph Twitchell, to join him for walks.
Twain and Twitchell would take these wonderful long walks together, especially in the fall and the spring. But it's what they talked about during those walks that are so important. They talked about religion and politics and history and biography, everything under the sun, current events.
Twitchell and I had a long walk in the woods. I got to telling him about old Mississippi days of steamboat and glory and grandeur as I saw them from the pilot house. He said, "What a virgin subject to hurl into a magazine." I hadn't thought of that before.
Twain is so moved at that notion that he writes William Dean Howells and says, "You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to write a series of short pieces, just a number of chapters, whatever you can use in the magazine, about my time on the Mississippi." And so those do get published, and they're known as Old Times on the Mississippi, which of course eventually becomes Life on the Mississippi, and may in fact have even pushed Twain further into his recollections of his youth that would bring us ultimately Huckleberry Finn. In the end, he owes that to those long walks with Joseph Twitchell.
Twitchell always had projects that he wanted the parishioners to do for him and to help him with causes and so forth. And one of the causes was a young man by the name of Yung Wing that came to Hartford. It was the first graduate of Yale that had connections to China. This whole area became involved in supporting Yung Wing and some of his causes, and Twitchell would have Hawley and Mark Twain work on these causes.
Chinese laborers had laid thousands of miles of railway track in the construction of the Transcontinental Railway. The influx of Chinese immigrants provokes American fears about jobs and the rights of citizenship. A political movement to stop Chinese immigration and deny Chinese people citizenship gains momentum. Joseph Hawley demands rights for Chinese people in the Hartford Courant. Twain calls on Grant with Yung Wing. They hope to persuade Grant to head a syndicate of investors in the railway in China. Grant declines the offer. Economic times at home are too uncertain to invest in foreign projects.
Twain heard that Grant was about to embark on writing his memoirs. Twain, being a good businessman, thought, this is going to be a remarkably strong bestseller, and I'd kind of like to get in on it. But he also knew that it could be a very important work in defining American literature, one of those great documents of American life at the end of its first century. But as he came to know more about the deal, he recognized that Grant's family was in terrible financial straits, on the verge of bankruptcy, and that Grant himself was dying slowly and miserably of throat cancer. So Twain, starting out probably, wanting to go in and just be part of a great financial deal that would be a boon to his publishing company, to Twain's own publishing company. Instead, when he recognized the circumstances, it became a sweetheart deal that pulled the Grant family out of bankruptcy by far, and also became an opportunity for Twain to lionize this extraordinary American in Ulysses S. Grant.
The second volume was finished last week to the last detail and was formally delivered to Charlie Webster at Mount McGregor last Saturday, 18th July. General Grant, having not another interest in this world to live for, died.
The Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant became financially the most successful publishing venture in American history until World War II. And it allowed Twain to write, in its first year, royalty checks to Grant's widow for over $200,000.
Grant's memoir begins, "My family is American, and has been for generations in all its branches, direct and collateral." Twain introduces the main character of his new book, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, with similar language. "I am an American. I was born and reared in the state of Connecticut, so I am a Yankee of the Yankees." However, inventions and schemes distract Twain from his writing. He brings a knight in full armor to visit Mrs. Stowe. With Susie, Clara, and Jean as his helpers, he marks out the playing field for a history game in the yard.
Day before yesterday, I struck a dull place in my head. So I knocked off work and measured off the reins of the English king in our roadway, a foot to a year, from the conqueror down, and drove a peg in the ground for each king. My notion is to get up an open-air game, which shall put all these names and dates and statistics into the children's heads without the bore of study. I got vastly interested in this nonsense, and after I went to bed last night, I worked out a plan for making it an indoor game also. Play it with cards and a cribbage board.
Clemens perfects the board game, calls it Mark Twain's Memory Builder, and patents it. Over the next few years, he wastes weeks of effort on inventions such as the history game, a perpetual calendar, and an improved bed clamp. He and Twitchell learned to ride a bicycle. In a letter to Atlantic Monthly editor William Dean Howells, Twain writes, "I must speculate in something, such being my nature." During a game of billiards, Clemens hears about a new typesetting invention being developed by a brilliant inventor at the Colt factory in Hartford. A typesetter in his youth, Clemens becomes intrigued with the Page compositor. James W. Page claims his machine can do the typesetting work of 10 men. Twain agrees to be a primary investor in the new machine and to recruit other investors.
Twain was eager to get investors from every aspect of his life, and he asked close friends and associates, he asked old friends from San Francisco, and even to his closest group of intimates, the Monday Evening Club. Surely during those gatherings, they heard constantly about the marvels of this new invention. And of course, Twain was trying to ask many of these men, all so well capitalized to be sure, to invest in the machine.
At a meeting of the Monday Evening Club, a select group of Hartford lawyers, ministers, and businessmen, Twain encourages the owners of the Hartford Courant, Hawley and Warner, to invest in the Page Compositor. Despite its promise, Page's machine, with its 18,000 movable parts, needs constant tweaking and is unavailable for demonstration. Twain is undeterred and continues to fund the Page Compositor. By his 50th birthday, Sam Clemens is an established author, a successful publisher, and a businessman. In a poem to mark the occasion, Charles Dudley Warner writes, "You may think it an easy thing to be 50 years old, but you will find it's not so easy to stay there." Olivia has just turned 40.
Will you love me in December as you do in May? Will you love me in the good old-fashioned way?
Livy, darling, let us look forward to the coming anniversaries with their age and their gray hairs, without fear and without depression, trusting and believing that the love we bear each other will be sufficient to make them blessed. Your husband.
As you do
In the summer of 1886, Calvin Stowe, a biblical scholar and Harriet's husband of 50 years, dies. Harriet's mind begins to wander, and her twin daughters and an Irish maid care for her at home. Charles Webster informs Clemens that Henry Ward Beecher is considering an autobiography. C.L. Webster and Company pays $100,000 for the rights to the book, but Henry falls ill. Isabella Beecher Hooker tries to reach his bedside. She expects a deathbed apology and admission of his guilt in the Tilton scandal. Henry's wife will not admit her. Henry dies, and Isabella is barred from his funeral. She joins a long public queue to get a last glimpse of her brother. Twain struggles with a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, amid the distractions of trying to raise capital to support the Page Compositor.
For the first time in a long while, I am so situated that I can't well leave home. I've begun a book whose scene is laid far back in the twilight of tradition. I have saturated myself with the atmosphere of the day and the subject, and got myself into the swing of the work. If I peg away for some weeks without a break, I am safe. If I stop now for a day, I am unsafe and may never get started right again.
A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, Twain had started one summer, as he described it, as a summer's amusement. And when you first read the work, the early chapters are very short and they're filled with word plays and pratfalls. And it's a very engaging and a very fast-paced book. But it's also a little window onto Hartford at that time. Morgan is a senior machinist at the Colt Firearms Factory. And that's the expertise that he brings back to Arthurian England, very much to its benefit early on, but as we know towards the end of the book, to its undoing. Twain knew these kinds of men, hardworking, inventive machinist who took the kind of mineral wealth of America's natural fecundity and turned it into the great inventions and life-transforming implements that made America this power that it was becoming at the end of the 19th century. The end of the work is really about Morgan's introduction of the more horrific aspects of technology into King Arthur's world. It's in parallel to Twain's own life. The failure of the Page Compositor, the family kind of inch by inch coming to the edge of bankruptcy, a machine that constantly breaks down, costs Twain nothing but money, $3,000 a month For 44 consecutive months, Twain invested in 1880s dollars, and it never turned a penny of profit. And that ending, which is this kind of terrifying technological apocalypse, where Arthur's knights are slain by this band of adolescents who happen to have electrified fences and gasoline trenches and Gatling guns, the book is transformed by the failure of technology. Even as in Twain's own life, he begins to lose almost everything that he had worked so hard for because of technology, the page compositor. So is King Arthur's England undone with the introduction of 19th century technology. And it's a chilling connection between Twain's own life and his creative work.
Twain's other affairs are no less disappointing. In December of 1889, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is published. After 6 months, only 24,000 books have sold, a disappointing showing. The Charles L. Webster Company begins to fail. Twain is unable to continue supporting the page compositor.
I watched over one dear project of mine for 5 years. Spent a fortune on it and failed to make it go. And the history of that would make a large book in which 1 million men would see themselves as in a mirror. And they would testify and say, "Verily, this is not imagination. This fellow has been there," and after they would cast dust upon their heads, cursing and blaspheming.
The failure of the page compositor and the C.L. Webster Publishing Company leaves the Clemens family in great financial stress. They move to Europe, where the cost of living is appreciably less. Alice Hooker Day and her family visit the Clemenses in Europe.
Mrs. Clemens talked longingly with Mother of the Hartford house and her desire to return to it, for we finally were turning our faces homeward. Mother had the happy idea of asking Mrs. Clemens the great favor to consider renting their beloved house to us. Mrs. Clemens granted her request, saying that only for her dear Alice would she have considered it. They had closed the house in '91, expecting to return before long themselves, and practically nothing but the silver had been put away. Everything else was in place. Catherine Day.
Twain travels, lectures, and writes until 1896, when he is able to settle his bills. Susie had returned to Nook Farm from Elmira to attend the funeral of Harriet Beecher Stowe. She and Jean stay with the Warners, visit friends, and prepare to join the family in Europe. On the day they are to leave Hartford, Susie becomes ill with spinal meningitis. The Day family is away, but the Clemenses' home is opened, and Susie is made comfortable there.
It was while we were away that Susie came home from Elmira to Hartford. Most of the family friends were away, it being the height of the summer. She died in her own house, with Mr. Twitchell and loving relatives in attendance near her. She was an exquisite being, almost too ethereal for this earthly sphere, but a blessing to have upon it. I have often thought since what a lifetime of loss it has been to those of us of her age group who might have had the pleasure of her companionship these many years.
Livy's brother sends a cablegram to Sam Clemens. Susie could not stand brain congestion and meningitis, and was peacefully released today.
It is human life. We are blown upon the world. We float buoyantly upon the summer air a little while, complacently showing off our grace of form and our dainty iridescent colors. Then we vanish with a little puff, leaving nothing behind but a memory, and sometimes not even that. Ah, well, Susie died at home. To us, our house was not an unsentient matter. It had a heart and soul and eyes to see us with, and approvals and solicitudes and deep sympathies. It was of us, and we were in its confidence, and lived in its grace and in the peace of its benediction. The spirits of a dead hallow a house for me. Susie died in the house we built in Hartford. Mrs. Clemens would never enter it again. but it made the house dearer to me. I've entered it once since it was tenantless and silent and forlorn. But to me, it was a holy place and beautiful.
For 7 years, the Clemenses left the house exactly as it had been when Susie died. They finally sold it in 1903.
To a child, Nook Farm was a misty land of golden glory, where my dear mother's relatives lived, and where the chestnut harvest in the autumn, falling from the beautiful chestnut trees on the slope, running down to the little brooklet from my grandfather Hooker's house, remained one of the perennial delights of autumn. Now, alas, the golden glory of the autumn is gone. The chestnut trees were killed by the blight, and the brooklet is filled up, while the Hart and Hegeman factories occupy the woodsy meadows lying southeast of this and the old Charles Dudley Warner house. Catherine Day.
Catherine Day, the daughter of Alice Hooker Day and the granddaughter of Isabella Beecher Hooker, begins a 50-year struggle to preserve the neighborhood from destruction. In 1929, under her leadership, the Friends of Hartford raise enough money to purchase Mark Twain's house, which has been a school and later subdivided into apartments. To help with the mortgage, the organization rents the drawing room to the Hartford Public Library. Where the Stows, Warners, and Hawleys had dined, strangers check out books. In the early 1960s, urban renewal and construction of a new highway caused the demolition of many of the old homes in the neighborhood. But Catherine Day continues to press for preservation.
Catherine Day she's a phenomenal person. I mean, she was one of the icons herself of historic preservation, one of the pioneer women who, through organizations like the DAR and various clubs, not only preserved the Harriet Beecher Stowe House and the Frank Chamberlain House, but was a kind of one-person historic preservation movement. And then at the end of her life, she really went out with a bang, you could say, by endowing the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center and its extraordinary library and making sure that the Harriet Beecher Stowe House became one of the first Victorian house museum restorations in the country.
The most important thing that places like Nook Farm can tell us, though, is the continuity between the actions that we take now and the impact that those actions can have in 10 years, in 50 years, in 200 years, and that we have to keep that in mind.
People just never would have imagined that Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe would be neighbors. And that also in the same neighborhood, you have these remarkable figures who helped define American politics and American publishing and American ideas about progressive social notions, about women's rights, about domestic science, about politics and religion. The ideas that were born here and the arguments that were marshaled in advance in this neighborhood had a profound effect on the way we think and act as Americans today, and I would also argue had a profound effect on the way the rest of the world thinks of who we are as Americans. Whether it's in Uncle Tom's Cabin or Huckleberry Finn, the courage that is the best in us as Americans when it comes to issues like personal freedom and responsibility and dealing with the issue of the racial divide and exposing corruption in American politics and finance. These are the great lessons that emerge from the works that were written here in Nook Farm.
So the good, the great, and the beautiful pass on. But what a fund of lovely memories they bequeath to the oncoming generations. May the guardians of these memories in Hartford cherish and preserve them within their own setting. Catherine Day.
This is PBS.